Non-metallic metal is a way of painting metallic surfaces without using any paints that contain metallic flake or shiny particles. It was very common in traditional art forms and in comic books. It does seem like quite a complex way to paint your minis, but once you break it down to its core principles and fundamentals, it becomes a lot less daunting. So there's a few core things that you have to remember whenever you're painting non-metallics. The first is the position of the light, whether it's in top left, top right, but generally just where it is within the scene. And it could be that you have multiple light sources like secondary lights or OSL, but we're not going to dive too deep into that today. The second is where the model is positioned in the scene relative to the light source. So it could be that the light's behind the model, in front of the model, to the left, to the right, up to you where it's going to be. The third is the position of the viewer. So we have to think about where the viewer is relative to the model and relative to the light source, because we have to think about how the light's coming into the scene, how it reflects off the model, and then how the viewer interprets that reflection, or whether they can even see that reflection. And finally, the finish of the surface, whether you have a matte surface or a shiny surface, as they both reflect light in different ways. So to be able to paint non-metallic metals, you need to be able to understand the basic shapes and volumes that make up your miniature. So these are basic three-dimensional shapes like spheres, cones, cylinders, donuts, and then flat planes, which are generally constructed into other three-dimensional objects like cubes. So we're going to start off with some cubes. Now, like I said, we generally treat these as flat planes that are then constructed into other objects, but you can see we have 3 planes here for each cube on the top and both sides, and you can see how they reflect light differently based off the finish of the surface. So now if we move on to cylinders, you can see we have a different reflection pattern where we have these big bands of light that appear across the surface. Some of them are a bit brighter, some of them are more like mid-tones, and then some of them are quite dark. And we also have some bounce lights in there as well. And you can see how these change based off the finish of the surface and also the color of the metal. Now, cones are kind of similar to cylinders as well. They just have a slightly different reflection pattern, but they do stick to that sort of banding style with these brighter highlights, maybe some slightly darker, some mid-tones, and then areas where there's no light interacting with the surface. Then if we have a look at some spheres, again you can see how these reflection patterns change based off the position of the light, position of the viewer, the finish of the surface, and also the color of the material. And then we have some more complex shapes like donuts, where we have these brighter highlights towards the top, then we have these like termination lines or dark sections, and then we have like some secondary highlights or some bounce lights interacting with it as well. At the start of the video I mentioned about the position of the light, the position of the model, and the position of the viewer, and how they all interact to create this non-metallic metal effect. We're going to look at some diagrams now that sort of help to explain that a wee bit better. Alright, let's have a look at a few different examples. In each of these examples, the light's going to be located in the same place and the model's going to be located in the same place. The only thing we're moving is the viewer. And let's see how that changes their perspective and interpretation of the scene. So in the first example, our viewer is going to be above the model. That means that the reflected light that they're going to see is going to be from the sky and from the sun or the primary light source. They're not going to see a lot of bounce light and a lot of reflected light from the ground or other elements within the environment. In example 2, it's going to be roughly in line with their eye line, and they'll see roughly equal amounts of the sky and equal amounts of those reflected lights and bounce lights from the ground or surrounding objects. And in the third example, whenever they're below the model, they're going to see mostly the reflected lights and bounce lights from the ground or the surrounding objects. They're not going to see any interaction from the sky and the model. So I'm going to try and break some of this down with some diagrams. Now it might seem like we're going back to school with some of these angle of incidence, angle of reflection, and the different diagrams that we're showing, but they're super beneficial whenever it comes to understanding non-metallic metals, understanding light, and understanding reflections. So in this diagram we're looking at a super shiny surface, and whenever the surface is really shiny it'll create a specular reflection. This is where the light hits off the surface, reflects back at the same angle into your eye, and creates this super bright reflection point. So the rest of the light is made up from the ambient light or the sky to create those midtones around the specular reflection. Anything after the termination line is reflected light or bounce light, so it's hit off another surface or another plane and reflected back onto the object. And the termination line is just where the primary light source stops interacting with the surface. And in this diagram we're looking at a rough or a matte surface, and what happens here is the light comes in and kind of bounces off at random directions, and a number of rays will enter your eye. This creates a softer reflection pattern, creating this diffuse reflection. You'll still have a termination line and bounce lights in this scene, but again the bounce lights will be a lot softer because of that matte rough surface. So I've covered an absolute boatload of theory to start, and this is just really an introduction into non-metallic, so let's see how we would actually go about applying this to our miniature. So I took a photo of my Necron before I started painting. You can already see some of those reflection patterns appearing in the model. If we boost the contrast, you can really see them stand out. And these reflection patterns map to certain volumes or certain basic three-dimensional shapes. So you can see I've identified some flat planes, some cylinders, and some spheres within the model. And if we start identifying where the reflections are in the flat planes, followed by the cylinders and then the spheres. This can be a really useful exercise whenever you're learning non-metallics and whenever you're trying to identify the shape and placement of your reflections. So just to reiterate, you can already see how the light is interacting with the different surfaces on the model. So all we have to think about is how the light is entering the scene and how it's exiting the scene towards us. So you'll see there's areas of reflected light here on the model, and all we have to do is try to make them look pretty. So we're going to start off with some Mechanicus standard grey, and we're just going to block in those areas of reflected light that we can already see within the scene. Whenever you're doing this, just take into account the underlying three-dimensional shape or volume. Don't worry about small details or intricate parts of the model just yet. Also, this is really just a sketching phase. We're not worried about smooth blends, transitions, or anything like that just yet. We just want to get as much information on the model as possible. And throughout this process, I keep checking back on my monitor to make sure that my light placement is correct. So if you've taken a photo before you start painting, refer to that as you go. Now, because we want to create a shiny metallic surface, we're going to focus on creating more specular reflections. Now, if you remember back to earlier in the video, those are those super bright points that are created on shiny surfaces. So that means we'll be looking to create fast transitions in value, so moving quickly from our darkest colors to our lightest colors to create that shine and that brightness to our reflections. Once you've mapped everything in, it should look something like this, and you can see it's extremely rough, but if you really squint your eyes, it starts to look a wee bit like a metallic surface. Now, to soften out our transitions, we're going to use a mix between Mechanicus Standard Grey and Abaddon Black. We're going to use this to sort of stipple around the edge of those initial highlights. This just helps to create a wee bit of distortion and a wee bit of noise in these areas, kind of roughing them up a wee bit, and just helps to soften out those transitions. I think this is a great way to start whenever you're doing non-metallics, instead of worrying about glazes and try and create super soft transitions through your metallics, because this allows a wee bit more leeway. So just work around your miniature and soften out each of those transitions. We're not worried about bounce lights or anything else right now, we're just identifying the reflections from the primary light source and softening those out. Now we're going to start building those values. So we're coming in with some Fenrisian grey, and I've switched over to a size 0 brush now from Artist Opus, just so I have a wee bit more control of where I'm placing those lights. We're going to start to emphasize that lighting pattern and create brighter reflections across those areas. Whenever I'm doing this, I'm still leaving some of the previous layers showing, so we have that transition from our Abaddon Black to our Mechanicus Standard Grey and Abaddon Black mix, and then our Mechanicus Standard Grey and now our Fenrisian Grey. You can see I'm also starting to pick out some of those edges. Whenever you're doing non-metallic metals, identifying edges creates a lot of shine, especially whenever they're beside quite dark areas in the model. And that's mainly because you're creating a large value jump between those two spaces. And you can see as I'm working around the model and bringing in some more highlights, I'm also respecting the underlying shape. So thinking about whether it's a flat plane, whether it's a cylinder, whether it's a sphere or a cone. You might have also noticed that I'm starting to kind of stipple in more of my highlights now, just to create a wee bit more texture and a wee bit more information across the model. Again, this just means that I don't need to worry about creating super smooth transitions across the model. That way I can focus more on the light placement and the overall theory and technique behind non-metallic metals. If you're enjoying the videos so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps promote the videos and helps the channel grow. Also, if you're feeling frisky, give that subscribe a wee slap and a tickle. You can also drop a comment below to help please the algorithm. So just continue to work around the model, emphasizing those reflections and drawing more attention to some of the details within the model. Remember, think about whether it's a sphere, whether it's a cone, whether it's a cylinder, and make sure you're placing your highlights in the correct place. If you need to go back in the video and check out some of those reference pictures, by all means do so. Now whenever I'm working in the chest, I'm really working to sort of edge highlight those ribs or that rib-like structure within there. because again that creates a lot of contrast between the edge highlight and the flat plane beside it. That massive jump in contrast will create a lot of shine and really give that non-metallic metal feel. Now you'll also see that I occasionally go back and kind of layer up that Fenrisian grey just to give it a wee bit more opacity and a wee bit more punch in certain areas. So whenever you're doing this, do thin down your paints to a layer-like consistency, so it should take 2 to 3 passes to create an opaque layer. This will allow you to create softer transitions as you work across the model. Now when I'm working on the gun, I know that that's just one big cylinder, or at least that's how I'm thinking about it right now. So I'm focused on creating those bands of light that we talked about earlier in the video to really help emphasize that volume and that shape. Now the body of the gun's basically made up of a number of flat planes to create these, cubes or cuboid-like shapes in certain areas. So I'm just creating a number of reflection patterns that we've seen earlier in the video to really emphasize that, flat plane or that cuboid or cube-like structure. But again, I'm taking advantage of some of those super sharp edges that they have there, so I can create really strong contrasting edge highlights in those areas. Now to start highlighting my Fenrisian grey, I like to use Hykey yellow, and this is a very high value desaturated yellow. It almost gives the impression of some sunlight entering the scene and interacting with the metal components. I feel it gives a more natural and organic feel to the reflection patterns and just adds in a wee bit more interest with those contrasting colours. But again, you'll see I'm going through exactly the same process that I did with the Fenrisian grey. I'm just covering slightly less area this time and really starting to focus in on the brightest points within those reflections. I'm still using that stippling technique to create these highlights, but I'm really focusing on creating as much contrast as possible now. So I'm trying to create really bright highlights within a small space while still respecting the underlying shape of the volume. And again, you'll see that every time I sort of add in new highlights, I always check back to my monitor to make sure things are looking correct. And you should definitely do this whenever you're working through this process and whenever you're learning non-metallics. Always go back to your reference picture to make sure you're placing your highlights and your reflections in the correct place. And you can see I'm really focusing on hitting those edge highlights to create maximum contrast in those small areas. And some of the areas like the top of the gun are pretty much perpendicular to the light source, so they'll actually be getting a boatload of light. So we need to make sure our highlights and reflection patterns indicate that. Again, I'm still treating the gun like a massive cylinder, so I'm really focused on creating those massive bands of light that run up and down the length of the cylinder. And I'm sure you've heard this one before, but the process of creating non-metallic metals is one that you really have to trust. Right now, it may not look fantastic and it may not look polished or finished, but by the end of the process, it will look good. So trust that you're doing the right thing whenever you're painting this. And if you're following your reference photo, you really can't go too far wrong with the placement of your highlights and the placement of your reflections. Now, just like we did with our Abaddon Black and Mechanicus Standard Grey mix, we're coming back in with the Fenrisian Grey just to stipple around some of those Hykey yellow highlights. This will just help to soften out some of the highlights and just smooth out those transitions. This is also an opportunity to widen some of those highlights and give the impression that some ambient light is interacting with them. This will help to create those midtones and impart some colour into our metallic surface. Now the last thing we need to do is add in some spots of titanium white across the model. This is to give the impression of the brightest highlights, or almost that glint off the metallic surface. This would be the brightest point within the specular highlight. Now I will say be sparing with this, because if you add too much white, it'll create a large area of high value and it actually lowers the overall impression of the high values, if that makes sense. So I'm pretty much saying the more white you add, the less bright it'll look. Now remember we talked about the bounce lights, so we're going to quickly add in some bounce lights to certain areas of the model. Bounce lights occur whenever the light has bypassed a certain section of the model, interacted with another surface, be it the ground or another part of the model, and then reflected up to the underside of that area. So you can see I'm adding in some bounce lights to the underside of the gun. This is because the light would have come down and either hit the second cylinder at the bottom and reflected up onto the top cylinder, or it would have hit the ground and reflected up onto the bottom cylinder. Now your bounce lights will always be of a lower intensity than your main reflections. This is because the primary light has come in, it has interacted with another surface, muddying the color and the intensity, and then reflected back onto the model. So whenever you're placing your bounce lights, you're really trying to emphasize the shape of the volume and really give it that three-dimensional feel. And remember, whenever you're placing your bounce lights, you always have that termination line between the two areas. And the termination line is where the primary light has stopped interacting with the surface. So you almost have this area of really low value between the areas of primary reflections and the bounce lights. Now you can use a bit of Mechanicus standard grey, just to add a wee bit more definition and detail within your bounce lights, so just to really help to shape those components within the model. Now again, whenever you're highlighting up your bounce lights, make sure you respect the underlying shape and always take into account the shape of the volume, because that will dictate the shape and overall structure of your reflection pattern. And just like in the previous steps, I'm going back to my original mix just so I can soften out those transitions between the colours, or maybe add in more separation and definition between the primary reflections and the bounce lights. Now one thing to keep in mind is that the bounce lights will be more intense the closer the surface is to the object reflecting the light. But hopefully you found this interesting. I can only hope that the information I've provided you today will encourage you and give you the confidence to try painting non-metallic metals. It's a super fun approach and gives you a really interesting finish across your model, and gives you so much control whenever it comes to placing light and setting a scene. But let's get this boy on the spinny thing and get a look at the final piece. So you can see that we've created a boatload of contrast across the model, creating those super bright specular highlights with those spot highlights of titanium white, then into those termination lines where we almost go back into Abaddon black, and then with those bounce lights with Abaddon black and Mechanicus standard grey underneath. Now I know I've covered a load of theory today and a load of different principles, so if you have any questions, please drop them below in the comments and I'll be sure to answer every one of them. And if you want to get any additional pointers, head on over to the Discord. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have any comments, questions or suggestions for future videos, please drop them below in the comments. And if you want to show me what you've been working on, head on over to the Discord and drop some pics into the whips or the completed projects. I'd love to see what you've been painting. If you'd like to get some personalised coaching and tuition, head on over to the Patreon and check out the available packages. There'll be something there to suit everybody. All links can be found below in the description. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you at the next one.